Let's take a quick look at some coding standards in C#. Right now I have this console window application open. Um, and in this console window application, we're just going to look at some simple constructs that we need to understand as we're coding in C# and, for that matter, any other programming language. So there's some coding standards that's out there. And these standards are a set of guidelines or best practices and programming styles, and even some conventions that developers follow when they are working with any sort of code, any sort of source code for any project. And that could be for any company. And in fact, that is for most big companies that's out there. These standards exist. So as soon as you get a job at any company, the first thing that you're going to learn as a programmer are the coding standards of that organization. And the coding standards are a set of rules, basically, that you have to follow so that everyone can be on the same page when they're reading code, when they're writing code, and when they're sharing code. So to be clear, there are some coding standards that every programmer follows, and then there are certain coding standards particular to each company. So you want to be aware that the coding standards that every programmer follows, you're going to be expected to know those standards as you move forward whenever you get a job or move forward into any organization. And on top of that, then you will incorporate the company's or the organization's coding standards. So the first standard you want to be aware of is when you're creating variables, you want to give it a name that makes sense. Like this name right here, this is not a variable, this is a function, but you see it says main. So it's the main function. And let's give you an example of a variable that makes sense. But first, let's take a quick look at variables. Here I have this PowerPoint view here, and I have a box here that's open, and then I have another box that's closed. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable inside of this here, and I'm going to give that variable a name, and then I'll show you what that means in this view here. So as I go through here, I'm going to create a string variable. Now, as I add that string declaration there, basically I'm saying this box can only take strings. Okay, so, and I'm just going to label that box string. So that means the only thing that goes in that box are strings. And what is a string? A string is basically like this: hello world, is anything in quotes. And I'm going to give that string a name. So I called it name because I wanted to hold names. Then I put the equals, and then I put the open quotes and close quotes, and then I close it off. And I always do this. Whenever I have something like quotes or anything like that that I have to open and close, where information goes in between, like this hello world, it's in between these quotes, I make the quotes first, and then I close it immediately so there won't be any mistakes later on. And then I go in between that, and then I write what I want. So I'm just going to say this variable contains this name. And in this view here, that means I took an element called name. It's a string, and Malik is a string because it was in quotes, right? I'm putting it in that box. Boom. And this box only takes strings. This box that only takes strings now has Malik inside of that box. And I can take it out and do what I want with it. I can even open it up and change the name inside of there to something else. So I can just go here and later on change the name. I named this variable name because that's what it will contain. Now I don't want to name this variable car because it doesn't contain any information about a car. And that's basically what that means when the coding standard says make sure that you name your variables something reasonable. For instance, this shouldn't be string C. This will work, but this is not a proper coding standard. Now, one thing we want to look at here is that, yes, this is a variable and it's a box. And let me put this back to name because this box is labeled as actual name. If I were to do this exactly how I have it coded, this box will only take strings. So I'm going to put that label up there to where what this can take. But the name of this box, the name of this variable is name. And inside of that box And you can see the name is inside of there. And then I can change that to anything I want. As long as I make sure it's a string, I can take that string and put it inside that box. And the box is called name. Now, the one thing I wanted to point out is that this is not a variable. This is called a constant. A variable is something I can take out and change the name. So I can take any variable I want, take it out, and make it whatever I want. I can make it to any string that I want, as long as that is in quotes. And then it will be inside of that box. This, however, when you create a constant, it remains that. You can't open it up and change it at all. Once you make it, it remains the same. That's the only difference between a variable and a constant. So we have no constants here. We simply have a variable, the box, with the string name inside of there, because we know the box will only take strings. And we could have named this anything like we said before. The other standard we want to talk about is the one that I actually mentioned initially, is the proper naming of functions. And this right here is a function, is a static function. It doesn't return anything, so this tells you whether it returns something. We'll talk about that later. Don't worry about that so much. I'm just letting you know what it means. Void simply means it returns nothing. And here is the name of the function. And this right here are the arguments the function takes within these parentheses. So don't worry about, again, what that means so much. We'll talk about that later. And if you understand what it means, that's fine. I'm not really interested in getting to that right now. But for right now, understand that this is the name of the function. And the thing about a function is that it is an action. Functions are basically an action. It runs code. Okay. Now, the name of the function should tell you in some way what it's doing. So this main function shouldn't be called ER. That is not a name that means anything to anybody. So proper coding standards would be to name functions for what they do. This is a main function. Let's take a quick look at functions really quick so you can have a more clear idea of what a function is as opposed to a variable. So let's make something as clear as day. This right here represents a function. This actually is a function. Now, functions exist throughout all programming. Variables exist throughout all programming. So don't think that you're learning this for C or for C++ or for Visual Basic or for Python or for R or for any programming language. Functions exist throughout all programming language. Variables exist throughout all programming languages. Now, I'm sure there's probably some wacky programming language out there that doesn't have any functions. I don't know what it is. It may be alien. But all the other programming languages that's human have functions. So I want that to be clear, and I don't want you to be confused by anything. So every programming language has functions. Here we have a static function. We'll talk about that later. It returns nothing. Now this void, I was talking about this earlier. This void right here simply means the output here is going to be nothing. So this void right here. So if I were to represent that void as this box, right? So this void is the output. This part right here, this args, is the input. So if I were to represent that here, that's what's going inside of the function. And this part right here is the main element of the function. So if I were to represent that here, that would be there. And this is the structure of all functions. Now, even though you do see that this console write line does something, it prints something out, the function is not returning that. The function is simply doing that. So you need to really grasp that difference. If the function was returning it, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to print something out onto the screen. That's not the same thing. We will go deeper into that later. I just don't want to go into anything too complex. But right now, just understand that simply because this function is doing something that prints something out to the screen, it doesn't mean it returns anything. You'll know if a function returns anything if this is not void in C#. In other languages, you may not have to have the void there or even show that a function is returning anything. So this function right here is called main. If we were to create a new function, we'd want to have that function have some purpose and a proper naming convention. Let's look here. If we were creating a function, let me undo that. There we go. So let's create a function that prints out the name. All right, so the first thing we do is we're going to, and we'll talk about this again later, because we are in a main area that's using the static word, we want everything to use that static word. So we're going to proclaim that everything is static, not static. And then so I'm going to proclaim a static void. It doesn't return anything, so we're saying it doesn't return anything, and we're going to call that print, or how about display name. Now that means that should mean my function will display a name. I don't have any arguments in here, and I'm going to open and close my brackets. Like I told you guys before, I always open and close everything first before I do anything, and then I take one of those brackets and I push them down so I have some space in the middle. And now all I need to do is print the name out just like this. So I'm going to say right here, console.writeLine. And in that write line, I need a variable in there that's a string, because it takes a string and it outputs a string. So because it takes a string, I can put quotes there for an empty string and put anything I want in there, except I want this variable in there. And that variable is a string. So I don't really need to put that in quotes because the variable itself is a string. So I can do that. And now what that will do is print out whatever that variable is when this runs. Now, one thing you have to understand about functions is that they don't run unless you tell them to run. So even though I wrote this, it doesn't mean it's going to run till I put it in a function that's running, executing at the time. So it doesn't naturally run. The thing about this main function, what's special about it, is that when this program runs, this is the first function that will run regardless. Now what I can do is take that in consideration and move this and call this function here. So I can just type that function, display name, and close it. Now I have a function with a proper name, and it's running inside of the main function. So if I were to leave this like this and I were to hit run, what you will see here, right there at the top, right here, you see it says Malik. So it did run properly, exactly like what we wanted. And there's our coding convention in full display, if you will, that we named this display name, and that's exactly what it does. And we used our variable inside of that function. Now, a lot of times as you're moving through this, you want to remember stuff. You want to actually, because you're going to have to be working with a team all the time in programming. There's no other way around it. Even if you're working by yourself, you're working with a team in some form or fashion. And so you want to leave notes, including you want to leave notes for yourself. You want to leave comments for yourself. So comments are different than variables and functions and constants and stuff like that. Variables and constants and functions run in the program, and the program translates those into machine language. Comments are not code. They are not recognized by the compiler as any code. They're just there for your consumption or your team's consumption. So we want to use comments to be able to tell us what our function is, because just like anything, if you wrote a bunch of code and you come back like months later, those comments are for you too, so you can remember what you did. So a lot of times with this, when you do something like this, you may want to add a comment. So let's talk about comments. Let's talk about three different kinds of comments. So there's three different commenting styles, and first of all there's the single line comment style, and that would look something like this. If I wanted to say, okay, I want to put a comment for this variable. This, let's say, name will change later. And I want to put a comment that this describes this function. So I can say this function and I can put a variable, a comment here. I mean, you can put comments anywhere. You can put them outside a function, inside a function, inside of a class, outside of a class. And this is considered a single line comment. So I can put comments anywhere. The second kind of comment is a multi-line comment. So if I wanted to make a comment that was multi-lines, instead of putting these slashes over and over and over again, what I can do is I can go this / and then I'm going to do the / again. So there's 2 forward slashes there, just like before. And on the inside, I put stars. And now I can just type whatever I want in there. So this entire class, this whole thing encapsulates everything here. And you can see that little dotted line that encapsulates everything. If I were to close this, you see it encapsulates everything. This variable here exists inside of this class. This function here exists inside of this class. And this function here exists inside of this class. So you see that everything exists inside of the class. And that gives you a little clue about how programs will be working in C#. Everything exists inside of a class in one way or another. So when we want to know exactly what this class does, we can put comments for the class itself. And I can go up here, and all I got to do is do 3 slashes. I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, and it automatically adds that summary. Well, this IDE automatically adds the summary. So it all depends on the IDE you're using. I'm using Visual Studio. Now I can just go ahead and add the summary. Put information. This class is for. And there's our 3 different comments. We have our summary comments, we have our single line comments, and we have our multi-line comments. And you want to be able to use these because it's really going to help you develop further and further into more complicated and more complex applications with team members, plus even with yourself, so you can go back and edit your code. One important note about variables is that they can't start with numbers. So if I put a 2 there, you see I get an error. So that's another sort of syntax information you need to understand. And that goes the same actually for function names. So you see, I can't start it with a number. If I click away from there, I get an error here. So I'm going to remove that. So go ahead and try some of this stuff yourself. Print out some stuff, make a few more functions, and run those functions inside of your main, meaning go down here, type another function, and run it inside of the main. Try it out.